Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Bree Kaufman. I am a school psychologist here at Warren Consolidated Schools. I just want to start out by saying everyone was going to get this form no matter what. This form was coming out regardless. I just volunteered to make a quick video to walk through it. The purpose of this form, or the reason we need it as special education staff, it's really to stay organized and to help us stay on track as we move students through their least restrictive environment. Least restrictive environment, or LRE, it's not just a phrase. I really want to stress that this isn't just some WCS policy or a tactic that's used. LRE is law. Schools must place students in their least restrictive environment. This basically means that students with special needs, they need to be educated as much as possible in general education classrooms alongside their non-disabled peers. This is a law. It requires that school districts create a continuum of alternative placements and options for students. It's a law that schools need to be able to document and show LRE is being followed. So that is where the idea of this form came from. So let's actually look at the form and how this is going to help us stay organized and keep on track as we move students through the MTSS process and in turn LRE. This is called the MTSS Provision of Services form. It's it's just a snapshot of the continuum of educational supports and services that the student has received. This is a snapshot of their supports, and because of that, this form is really just going to be filled out with dates, maybe some brief notes, but really we're just looking for dates and time frames. Here's an example of a filled out form. I think most of us are familiar with the concept of the three-tier process as it relates to general education. Here we have the general education column, and tier one of general education captures all students. We expect approximately 80% of students or so to succeed with gen ed classroom strategies and teaching. How do we know who's succeeding and who's not, though? At WCS, we monitor this through day to day classroom data and observations, of course, like teacher input and grades, but also we monitor this through benchmarking. WCS uses DRA, Common Reading Assessment for our younger friends, and NWEA, a Common Computer Adapted Test for our older students. And we give these tests in the fall and again in the spring to every single student to get an estimate of their skills. So here under Gen Ed Tier 1, you would be jotting down that information. How did they score? How did they do on that particular test? Based on that testing data and the classroom performance data, we then expect approximately 15% of students to be identified as needing something more than that basic gen ed instruction. So, this is where gen ed teachers should be working on troubleshooting issues like working in small groups with students and providing a bit more help in the classroom setting. MTSS Performance Matters found in Schoology can help here. Unfortunately, even with that extra tier two help, there's still approximately 5% of students or so that will require even more intensive intervention and help to succeed. So, this is additional support such as Title I, ESL services, consulting your district behavior consultant or ASD consultant if that seems appropriate. And if the student has still not made progress after documented Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions over an extended period of time, this is when a 504 plan or special education may be the next step. Consideration of special education for a student needs to be a discussion first that includes all relevant staff and the parent. At that stage, though, it does open up support options such as speech and language, social work, teacher consultant, and resource room supports. So let's say a student did enter special education, but even with these types of supports in place, the student's still struggling. At that point, resource room may be the next best step. Resource room can kind of fall into two different trajectories. There are students that have primarily academic concerns and those that have behavior concerns. Either way, the tier process, that multi tiered system of supports framework, it doesn't stop just because we're in resource room. We now have a tiered process for resource room, where at tier one, Students in Tier 1 of resource room, they're just getting those typical resource room services and they're getting progress monitored for those academic or behavior concerns. But let's say that's not enough and the student needs more. What are some Tier 2 type options while a student is in resource room? At this stage, it's important to then consider if assistive technology is being used. And also, we would need to look into increasing resource room minutes. Increasing resource room minutes or maximizing resource room minutes for a student should be considered first before moving on to more intensive type services. If you are considering more intensive types of services, it's important that those discussions are being documented somehow. So, again, this should be a discussion with all relevant staff, including the parent, and you're coming together to talk about the fact that resource room might not be enough. Type of Tier 3 interventions that you could be exploring at this stage would be consultation with the ASD or behavior consultant again, and perhaps a reevaluation is warranted. So, for example, if it's an academic concern, maybe there are talks of needing speech and language added or looking at a cognitive impairment eligibility, for example. Or if it's more of a behavior type of a concern, maybe a reevaluation is needed to get more data. Maybe you're considering a change in eligibility to OHI or emotional impairment. It's important that under the behavior column, we recognize that a Tier 3 type of intervention or service would be the creation of an FBA and a positive behavior support plan. So, if you have a student that presents with a behavior problem and you've already explored resource room and maximized resource room minutes, you are really going to have to look at the creation of that FBA and that positive behavior support plan, as those are absolutely required prior to consideration for programming. So we have a pretty high needs kid here as we have made it to the programming column. Let's say this child has gone through all of these other options and they are now in a program type classroom. So maybe that's MySci, a cross categorical resource room, or an emotional impairment classroom. These types of programs that WCS offers, they pretty much all intertwine now academics and behavior together. And a Tier 1 type of kid would be a kid that's doing well here with just those supports that are provided by that particular program. You are giving those services continually and your progress monitoring. But let's say that a child does need some more help than even that. What are some type of Tier 2 things that you can do once you're already in programming? At this stage, it's very, 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 very important that that FBA and positive behavior support plan are up to date. Even if it had been done over here somewhat recently, you have to acknowledge that this is a totally different environment now. Um, and so you really do need to review this and make sure that this is up to date. We also have county options through the MISD. We have MISD behavior consultant, which is different than our district behavior consultant. Same goes for the ASD consultant. And there's also a psychiatric consult available. So you're meeting with your teams again to discuss if these options make sense for the kid and you want to explore as much as you possibly can, because we don't want to leave any holes, so to speak, that someone could later come back and point to and say, well, you didn't try that. So we really need to make sure we're trying all of these things. If it is a student that receives speech and language services, this SLP communication profile is going to need to be updated as well. The reason for that is we're starting to get into Form 2 territory here. So hypothetically, we have a student, a WCS student, who has gone through our continuum of services, and they are now in our most restrictive setting at WCS. And we've tried all of these things, and we're here now in a type of Tier 3 situation under programming. In this Tier 3 situation, it is important that all relevant team members, including the parent, are now discussing whether a county-based program through the MISD would be the next best step for the student. When you are in a programming tier 3 situation, it's important to then reference your Form 2 materials, and that will take you the rest of the way.